So you're gonna show where you stretch all those people? So you're gonna show us the dungeon?
I might try to show a move or two.
Yeah. I'll take some moves, sir.
Do you feel that?
Oh, yes, sir. I don't feel my arms, sir. I can feel it.
Can you feel that, Tom?
Oh, yes, sir.
Red,
oh, yeah.
Rosy.
Yes, sir.
And by taking this arm back here, you just ease his hand in the position here. I got the power here to...
Stop it, sir. Stop.
You're listening to Hart Beat Radio.
Bob Johnson, live, Calgary, Alberta, Canada, from the Hart Beat Radio studios. Man, what a show we have this afternoon for you great fans of Hart Beat Radio. A man of courage. He's been there, done it. A testimony of how to help others. He shows so much courage and responsibility on some issues that we're going to talk about. A former star of AWA, WCW, All Japan, and WWF Wrestling, Mr. Del Wilkes. We'll bring the Patriot on in just a few minutes. I'd like to, first of all, introduce our host of the show, wrestler, booker, promoter extraordinaire, Mr. Bruce Hart. And Bruce, welcome back to Hart Beat Radio. Got a great show with Patriot Del Wilkes today.
Yeah, I appreciate the nice introduction, Bob. Yeah, I'm really pleased to have Del on. You know, I've had the pleasure of talking with Del previously, and he's got a great story to tell, and he's had a fascinating career through his, All-American football player, and attained the highest levels of college football, and then he became a huge star in the wrestling business, and he's experienced the highs and the lows. You know, he's unfortunately been, like a lot of other wrestlers, beset with some of the issues that unfortunately are prevalent in the wrestling business with, drug issues and painkillers, that kind of thing. And he's a survivor, though, and he's got a great story, and I'm hoping that some of our many listeners out there, hear the story. I've unfortunately myself had firsthand experience with just seeing, my brother-in-law Davey Boy and my tag team partner Pillman and my good friend Chris Benoit and quite a few others that have been down that road, and unfortunately had tragic outcomes. So it's an important issue that all too often is swept under the carpet or ignored or sugar-coated, whatever you want to call it, and I think one of the main reasons, in talking to Del and talking to you, Bob, that we're doing this is to get the message out there. If we can turn things around for the better for just a few people, that will have been well worth our while, because I hate to say it, I think there's still a lot of people out there in the wrestling business and maybe in other sports too, that have this, have been having problems with the drugs, and are not sure where to turn or how to start getting out.
Well, I had a really good talk to Del this week, and it's a true inspiration to me. On a personal note, I had the demons in my life a few years back, and I've been a long time. I've been sober for many years, and I was finally able to admit I had a problem. And like I say, when just talking to Del, Del is such a great spokesman and inspired me to keep doing it, staying clean and sober. But anyway, without any further ado, I'd like to welcome to Hart Beat Radio the Patriot, Del Wilkes. Welcome, Del.
Thank you for having me, Bob and Bruce. I've looked forward to this opportunity, and I certainly do appreciate it.
Del, you were a good friend of a dear friend of ours, Brian Pillman, back in was it at the University of South Carolina? And if you could tell us a little bit about start off maybe about your football career and bumping into Brian Pillman, and then I understand you met Wahoo McDaniel and started with Verne, and the rest is history. So I'll let you kind of start.
I was born and raised here in Columbia, South Carolina, my hometown, and college football in the South is absolutely just the dominant sport. It rules. It's the king of all sports, and like a lot of boys, I had a dream one day of playing for the University of South Carolina and being a Gamecock and playing at Williams-Brice Stadium, a stadium I went to many times as a kid to watch the Gamecocks play. And after a very good high school career here at a local high school, I was fortunate enough being recruited heavily by a lot of the schools all over the country to accept the scholarship at the University of South Carolina, and played there from 1980 through 1984. Had a teammate in 1980 that won a Heisman Trophy, George Rogers. And I was very fortunate my senior year in 1984. Up until that point, that was the most successful team in Gamecock history. Late in the year, we were ranked second in the nation and literally had a shot at playing for a national championship, but we lost late in the year, and so that couldn't happen. But I was most valuable player of that team, captain of that team, and a first-team consensus All-American. And so I was able to cap my career off with just a magical year in '84. But back in '83, Miami of Ohio came to Columbia to play us on a Saturday night in September. And that was my introduction to what would later become a dear friend and co-worker in the world of pro wrestling. And Brian was a bit undersized to be a football player, but for what he lacked in size, he certainly made up for it, more than made up for it, in talent, toughness, quickness. And so that Saturday night, Brian and I spent most of the night playing head up against each other. And I had nothing but admiration for him going into the game. As I was watching film in preparation for the game, you just noticed a guy that, again, while he may not have been the biggest guy on the field, had the biggest heart and the biggest motor on the field and had a ton of talent. And so I knew going into the game that, you know, it was going to be a battle all night long, and it was. And then, of course, later, you know, that developed into a bigger friendship in pro wrestling, and I thought the world of Brian. And I had a couple of tryouts in the NFL, and it just didn't work out for me at the next level. So I came back to Columbia, my hometown. I was with Tampa Bay in 1985, the Atlanta Falcons in '86, and Atlanta released me, and I came back to Columbia after they released me. And there was a school here in Columbia at the time that was owned and operated by the fabulous Moolah, one of the biggest names in pro wrestling, lady pro wrestling history. And I went through Moolah's school, and she was running the show here in Columbia one night and had Wahoo McDaniel on the show and on the card, and got a chance to meet Wahoo, and that altered the course of my wrestling career in the sense that Wahoo really took a liking to me and took me under his wing and took me out on the road for about 2 years with him and just taught me the business and taught me so much. And we had that football background in common, and I think that allowed me to get a lot closer to Wahoo, and will always be indebted and forever grateful to Wahoo for what he did for me and helping me get my career established in the beginning.
Did Wahoo take you up to AWA Verne and that, or I know he was involved with Verne at some point, so was that how you ended up with Verne Gagne and them up in around 87, 88, somewhere in there?
Yeah, I went up to Verne really on 2 occasions. Now, the first time Wahoo brought me up there, it was because of Wahoo. He had come to that show to work for Moolah. He had a couple of weeks off from up in Minneapolis and working for Verne. He came down south, and I met him, and when he got back up to Minneapolis, he told Verne about me, and just a few weeks later, I was heading up to the AWA, and so that was my first experience working for Verne. But yes, it was facilitated by Wahoo, absolutely.
How was AWA in those days? They had been like the probably the biggest territory in the States or North America. Was Verne still active in the promotion around that time? I remember talking to some of the guys. They were sending a lot of guys. There was a guy named Eddie Sharkey down there that was sending. He sent a lot of the Minneapolis guys, including your old buddy DJ Peterson and a guy named Larry Cameron, who was a football player as well. And how did you kind of get launched in Minnesota there? Was that with Verne, or was there anyone else playing major roles in running of the promotion at that time?
Well, it was basically Verne and Greg, and Verne, to answer your question about Verne, was he still involved? He was heavily involved. Verne was very much involved. Unfortunately, at the time I got there, the first time I went, they used me just as Del Wilkes, and then I was up there for several months, and then they shut down for several months because they were really on life support at that time. They still had the TV deal with ESPN, and they were on Monday through Friday from 4 to 5 o'clock Eastern time. So they shut down for a little while, and they brought me back up once they started running again. And this time when they brought me back up, that's when they approached me with the idea of the Trooper.
I remember hearing about that. That was a lot of guys were telling us, this guy down in Minnesota's got a great gimmick, the Trooper, and he writes tickets out to, I'm not sure if it's the heels for misbehaving or what, but I remember them coming up and they were all talking very positively about it,
That was Greg's idea, that after my finish, to take out the ticket book and write it and leave it either on the forehead or the chest of, my now unconscious opponent. And, they were always, I felt for Verne because Verne still had that competitive fire in him that he wanted to be relevant again in the wrestling business. As you mentioned, they were a huge territory at one time, and so much talent came out of there. But when I was there, that wasn't the case. It was a wonderful opportunity for me because it put me on nationwide TV 5 days a week through ESPN. But they were barely holding on, and they were just desperately looking for something to infuse some life in them, and basically to infuse a bunch of cash in there. And there was always that big deal right around the corner. Viacom was going to dump millions of dollars into the company and make them relevant again. But unfortunately, that never happened. It never came about. It never manifested itself. And so eventually they just folded up, locked the doors, and went out of business. And DJ and I were the last tag team champions in AWA history. And unfortunately, as you very well know, shortly after that, DJ tragically lost his life in a motorcycle wreck. But it was a great experience for me.
What year was that? About 90, 91, somewhere in there?
Yeah, it was. I think it was 90, maybe 91, but yeah, somewhere in that time frame.
Maybe 89, somewhere in there. He would work for us, and he'd made a great impression on my dad. My dad really liked him, and he seemed like a great guy, DJ. For years, my dad had started a lot of guys from Minnesota, or he sent a lot of guys that Verne made money out of, like Billy Graham, Superstar, and Billy Robinson. And my dad was always, is there any good-looking boys down there? He's always endeavoring to, what's his thing, what's his Del Wilkes? He's got something to offer, and all that kind of thing. So after the AWA, I was told you worked for Global at that time. I remember hearing a lot about them back in the day. There was a lot of hype and hoopla about they were maybe there was a number of them at that time. You'd hear all these names like Herb Abrams and these outfits out of New York and Carolina and California, and that were gonna give WWE or WWF, as it was called at that time, a run for their money. But where was Global out of? How did that transpire?
Well, they were. It started with Bill Eadie, who was the guy in Georgia that.
The Masked Superstar, and was later doing Demolition.
Yeah, Bill Eadie and Joe Pedicino, Actually, Joe was the one out of Georgia, and maybe at that time Bill may have been living in Georgia. But, I kept hearing, I got contacted by Joe maybe in 1991 after the AWA had folded, and as you said, they were going to be the next big thing, and they were going to compete with WWF and WCW. And again, just like the AWA, they had this big-time investor. With them, it was this big African billionaire that was going to dump tens of millions of dollars into this upstart company called the Global Wrestling Federation, and they were going to be a player. Well, the African billionaire disappeared, and so then they were scrambling to try to come up with money to get this thing started. But finally, I got notification from Pedicino and Bill Eadie that this was actually going to happen. And we did all of our TV tapings in Dallas at the old Sportatorium, and that was going to be the Global Dome, and we were going to be on ESPN in that same time spot that the AWA had. And so they sent me a ticket and wanted me to fly to Dallas for the very first TV taping ever for Global, and I took my gear because I assumed that I was going to be working as the trooper. And when I got there, literally about 4 or 5 hours before our first TV taping that night, Bill Eadie and Joe Pedicino approached me with the idea of doing a character called the Patriot. The United States military was involved in Iraq, had gone into Kuwait and liberated Kuwait.
Oh, yeah,
and
they just had the Desert Storm. That would have been a good time because there was a fair bit of anxiety about Saddam and Desert Storm and blah, blah, blah at that time. So did that ever get off the ground at Global, or just kind of faded from there?
At first it did. It had some traction because you had a combination of two things. You had some young, upcoming talent, some guys that were just trying to get their big break into the business, and they also combined that with some more established names, some older guys that they could bring me. Now, when I say older, I meant further along in their career, but Al Perez and Stan Lane and Bill Eadie and Nature Boy Buddy Landell. So you had a good combination of veterans and young guys that had a chance, and they just didn't have the deep pockets they needed to be able to compete with Vince and with Verne at the time.
And Del, I understand one of our old Stampede wrestlers, the late great Mike Shaw, better known to the wrestling fans as Mockin' Singh, was in the global wrestling for a little while with Rip Rogers, and I think Cactus Jack was down there too.
Mike was an entertaining guy. He had a great sense of humor. He was funny. He was sort of a curmudgeon, but he still had a good sense of humor. I always enjoyed being around Mike. He had a great sarcasm about him. He really did.
Oh yeah, he was classic. He had a little bit of a kind of a sardonic, cynical kind of flair to him, But yeah, that was what made him. He got over great up here, just playing an obnoxious kind of slob, WWE never used him right. They had him playing lunatics and all the other, but they just let him talk. That was his main strength, as being a sarcastic kind of obnoxious slob,
Yes.
I remember.
He did it well.
I remember, Del, when Mike Shaw was out in Vancouver working for the All-Star, he was just kind of I don't want to say jabroni status, but Bruce brought him into Calgary, and I remember Bruce said, "I'm amazed a great big guy like that." Bruce taught him how to take a few bumps, And then I got him on the talking, and he used to. I had him do a lot of radio interviews and stuff, and remember Mike would say to me, "Bob, are you mad at me today?" He'd almost be not in tears, but he'd say, "Didn't you have a radio interview for me today? Or, are you mad at me? I don't have a radio interview." But what a great guy he was. He was our number one up here.
He was the main heel with all those young guys, every one of them, Owen and Benoit and Pillman and a little Japanese guy named Liger. he was the main guy they all worked with, and he kind of got them all over and got them launched. It's kind of funny because he weighed about 400 pounds, and they were all about 190 or so, so funny. But somehow they seemed to get over, and he brought out the best in those guys. But after that, I'm told you headed to, you had a pretty successful stint in Japan, Del.
I did.
How did you get hooked up with Japan originally? Was that through Baba, or how did that transpire?
Well, my first time going to work for Baba, I actually went as the trooper, and this was probably 1990. And a guy named Jimmy Suzuki. I remember Jimmy. Yeah.
Yep,
Jimmy came to me. He was living in the States, and he would take pictures and work for some of those wrestling magazines in Japan. And
he knew everybody. He was a good conduit, or he had a good connection with all the right people in Japan. I remember he was always up here with different Japanese guys, mostly like you were saying, taking pictures. And a nice little guy, Jimmy, though. He's pretty accommodating.
Yes, very much. And he was the one that first approached me and said Baba would like for you to come do a tour with him. So I went in, I think, maybe June of 1990 as a trooper. And I'm going to tell you, Bruce, I was not prepared for the type of work that Baba's company was doing. And I stumped the joint up that first time I went. And I thought, well, at the end of a 3-week tour, I thought, man, this man will never have me back. I'm done. But you fast forward 2 years down the road, or a year and a half down the road, and now I'm doing the Patriot character. And I was just more experienced. I just had more ring time under my belt, and naturally, you get a little bit better at what you're doing when you get that kind of experience. And so he invited me back. Baba did. He called Jimmy, and Jimmy called me. And so in June of 92, or May of 92, I went over for my second time with Baba, and 3 nights in, Baba approached me and offered me a full-time job. And I was just blown away because, I had a lot of respect for Baba and the type of work they did and what he expected from, his talent as far as, the quality of the matches and the quality of the show. So, obviously, when he offered me a full-time job, I was in.
Who were some of the Baba's main guys by that time?
On the American side, you had Stan Hansen, Terry Gordy, Steve Williams, Danny Crawford, Doug Furness, Johnny Ace. And then on the Japanese side, of course, you had Jumbo and Mazawa and Kawada and Taue and Kabashi. So he had a ton of talent over there. I mean, just a ton of talent. And, of course, Dory was in and out a lot, and Abdullah the Butcher and Andre. So, it was a who's who of wrestlers. And I just, I was excited that I was going to have an opportunity to work full-time for Baba and work exclusively in Japan.
How long did that, you had a pretty good stint for 3-4 years in there, I heard.
Yeah, I was there probably almost close to 3 years the first time. And then Eric Bischoff called me because Eric was now running the show in WCW. And see, Eric was the guy that was doing our TV for Verne when I was working as the trooper.
Oh, yeah, that was his start, They flew me down there to discuss booking or something like that back in about somewhere in there, 92, 93, somewhere in there. And my brother-in-law was down there, Davey Boy, around that time. He had left WWE, and he was doing the thing with Sting, and they had some pretty good talent there. And Bischoff was, I think they're doing the tapings over at Universal Studios down there in Orlando or wherever the hell, and
it
seemed like
right.
they were on the verge of really taking off there, and then they had a lot of potential there, and I thought they were going to take off. They had Ted Turner's money, and they had, I'm not sure what happened. It seemed like a lot of things, kind of hit and miss or whatever, but.
Well, I signed a 3-year deal with them, and probably after the first year is when they scored that big coup and got Hogan away from Vince, and they brought in Savage and Honky Tonk Man and Beefcake and Nasty Boys, and so they had raided Vince's roster, and that's when they started locking everybody up with guaranteed contracts and stuff like that. And so, maybe a year and a half, not quite 2 years into it, it was apparent to those of us that were there before Hogan and Hogan's buddies got there that the company was now all about Hogan and Hogan's buddies. And so I just went to Eric and asked him if he would. Baba had approached me about coming back, and so I went to Eric and I said, "Look, man, you're not really doing anything. Marcus Bagwell and I were the tag team champs there a couple of times, but I said I just feel like I'm floundering around here. I didn't come here to be a tag team wrestler, and I said I got a chance to go back to work for Baba. I said if you'll just let me out of the deal, I'll go halfway around the world and work, and I'm not even going to be a threat to you or your company or your fan base." And he would not let me out of that last year of the contract, so I walked on him. Baba sent me a ticket, and I was supposed to be at a pay-per-view that night, and I was on a flight to Tokyo to go back to work for Baba, so I just walked out on Eric and just left. I thought it was the best thing to do for my career.
Pillman was in there around that time, but he had this kind of half. It was supposed to be a work, but it was a half shoot with Bischoff and the Booker Man thing, and he had nothing. I don't know what the prevailing issues were, but he had nothing good to say about Eric. He was, he was always calling me and telling me about all the ill-conceived things that went on down there. I remember they flew me down there. I'm not sure if you were around during that. This is when they did this angle with Davey Boy and Vader and Colonel Parker and a bunch of. They had a boat. They did this. They blew up the boat on the beach down in St. Petersburg, and it was like one of the worst abortions I've ever seen in my life. They had a dwarf with a shark fin, So everything. It was like beyond. I couldn't even do justice to it. I just arrived to. They had flown me down there, and I was observing this thing with the shark, the dwarf, and the boat blowing up, and it was like one of the worst abortions I've ever seen in my life, and it cost about $100,000. The cops were out there screaming, you guys didn't have a permit to have explosives on the beach, and people were all screaming and little kids crying, and the dwarf almost drowned. And it was like, and that was kind of a first-hand observation of all like that. But it was too bad, because at that time they had maybe as good a roster as WWE, and then they most of the guys that were the up-and-coming guys at that time ended up going to work for Vince, and that was like Steve Austin and Pillman and a few others, Benoit and Eddie Guerrero and a bunch of them, and I still couldn't believe, though, that they, with all of Turner's money, and they had a lot of pretty damn good talent. Barry Windham and Flair was down there, all those guys at that time, and it didn't seem like there was anything clicking. I don't know, there was the bad storylines, or it was almost hard to fathom that they couldn't, have succeeded with all those things, that they had at their disposal,
One thing, in my opinion, that hurt them tremendously is then they were booking by committee. It was just a large number of guys that were on this booking committee, and everybody had a special interest. I mean, Hogan was looking out for his boys, and Flair was looking out for his guys, and so-and-so's looking out for his guys, and it was really, really dysfunctional, to say the least. I mean, very dysfunctional.
I remember one of the worst examples that I saw at Dell was they had these taped matches at the MGM studios down in Disney World or wherever the hell, and they had some damn flunky wearing a clown outfit, and they had the audience, and they wouldn't let them leave. They had paid to get into Disney World, and then they told them they had to stay for 3 hours. But
they did.
In any case, they had the baby faces were coming out, which was Davey Boy and Sting and Barry Windham or whatever the hell, and they had this guy wearing a clown outfit holding signs, boo and cheer, or whatever the hell, and he's holding up a big sign, boo. So Davey Boy and Sting and Windham or whatever come out, and all the fans are booing them, and then Ole Anderson, who was one of the booking committee guys, comes out and starts screaming, dropping F-bombs on the fans, like, you effing morons, you're supposed to be cheering. And then somebody in the audience says, well, that guy with the clown outfit was holding a boo sign, so Ole starts screaming at him in front of all the crowd, and I started shaking my head and saying, it's no wonder they're, doing what they're doing down here.
Totally mismanaged. So I left there and went back to work for Baba for a second time. And then, the next step for me was after about a year and a half back with Baba, was I signed with Vince and signed a 3-year deal with Vince and went to work for him. And that's when, Bret and I were doing that angle together and the Canadian-American thing. And
I know Bret always told me that was like the highlight of his career in WWE was in and around 97 or somewhere in there when they were doing the anti-American and the American, and Bret and Davey and Owen and Neidhart and Pillman were, kind of making out to be anti-American, and they had guys like yourself and Steve Austin and Hawk and Animal, and I think Ken Shamrock was around then too. They're kind of, being the pro-American, and it was a simple concept, but I remember they did a pay-per-view up here in Calgary where they had Bret and all them as the faces, even though in the States they were heels. But it was called the Canadian Stampede, this big pay-per-view, and people were going nuts, and Owen and all those guys, they were delighted. They said it was, and I remember they told me they were doing the thing. Bret said he was doing matches with you. You were doing the Patriot thing then, and he said it was really, one of the high times of his whole career. There was so much excitement, and it seemed like everything was really taking off. And unfortunately, later on that year, they had first Pillman unfortunately died, and then that idiotic charade in Montreal, the screw job or whatever, and it kind of all dissipated. It was almost hard to believe. I remember my dad saying just a few months ago they were on top of the world and they had this, thing going all cylinders and everything was, and then all of a sudden it kind of just completely went to hell,
It did. And, you mentioned something, and it was one of the most fascinating times for me too as well, because I'm working with Bret now, and of course he's turned on America, and it was just the people down here just were all over him, and with the promos he would cut, and so Bret and I are working together every night, and then we go and do a Canadian tour. We had wrestled in Seattle one night, and the very next day we're on the west coast of Canada. And we've got about a 10-day run where we're literally working from the west coast of Canada all the way across to the east coast of Canada. And just like that, without anybody saying anything, I'm one night in Seattle, and I'm the baby face, and Bret's the heel. And the very next night, we're in Canada, and he was so beloved up there. I mean, he was everywhere, but in Canada, it was so strong at that time. And now all of a sudden, I'm the heel.
Yeah, I remember Steve Austin and those guys telling me, because the crowd was threatening to kill. They hated Austin's guts up here, and across the border, he was like the ultimate all-American redneck hero, and it was. But
let me tell you what happened to me one night, real quick, and I don't know where we were at in Canada. I can't remember the town, but we're probably about halfway into this 10-day run across the country, and Bret and I are working, the last match every night, and we literally, about a 20-minute match, and there were 6 different guys out of a crowd that either tried to get into the ring or did get into the ring, and they were coming after me. That's how beloved Bret was, and just by the fact that I'm working against him and I'm an American wearing this red, white, and blue mask, and they were wanting to kill me. So we literally cut the match short. For my safety, I got a police escort back to the hotel, and they walked me to my room. This gang of policemen did, and when I got to my room, one of the cops told me, he said, "Buddy," he said, "you're on your own now." He said, "My advice to you would be order room service. Do not unlock this door the rest of the night, or you're at their mercy." And but it was that hot.
And that's music to, as fans maybe don't know that, but it's music to your ears if you're a heel and they're booing you and threatening to kill you, and all it knows you're getting over, So, how long did you stay there after that, Del? I heard you had a bad injury to your triceps or somewhere in that.
Yeah, I did. I was already damaged goods when I got to Vince and went to work for him. I'd literally blown my knee out, and I'd yet to have any type of surgery to repair it, so I was struggling there. I'd blown my tricep out, and I was struggling there. And but I still, the opportunity now is to sign a 3-year deal and work for Vince. And I think I may have been there 8-9 months, a little less than a year, and I just couldn't continue to go. My body had failed me. It had just I had, through football and wrestling and the type of injuries I had and the severity of those injuries, I was done. I just couldn't continue to go. So, I guess I was maybe there 8-9 months, something like that, a year, not quite a year.
Did they release you, or did you leave on your own, or how did that happen?
Well, I had a conference call one day with my orthopedic surgeon. He and I, and then Vince and JR on the other end of the line. And, my doctor explained that this, hey, man, this guy's just got some severe injuries. He needs major surgeries. We're looking at a very long rehabilitation process. And so Vince, I guess he paid out. He paid me for a year, but they granted me my release. And so I'm going to tell you too, Bruce, at this time too, wrestling had just become almost a burden to me. Not only did I have the injuries, but to try to continue to work with those injuries, I'd been introduced to prescription pain medication several years before. And as a matter of fact, I was on the road with Kurt Hennig one night and complaining about an arm problem, and he gave me a couple of Percocets. And so when I got back home, I asked my doctor for a prescription of the pain meds, Percocet, to keep working. And those two, by the time I'm in the WWE and dealing with these severe injuries, had now blossomed from 2 one night before a match into over 120 Percocets a day. And
so that's pretty. That's Oxycontin, isn't it? Percocet, Percodan. Yeah. That seemed to be the one of the most common ones. I know Pillman was, that was what killed him, and I was told the same with Eddie Guerrero, and I was told Benoit had a thing with that too. But that was unbelievable. It seemed to be almost somewhat of an epidemic around that time, and I know there was different doctors out there. I used to always hear the stories from Pillman and Davey Boy and guys like that you'd get there's certain ones around the country where you'd get prescriptions from and that kind of thing, and it became kind of almost like a kind of a rash of guys having all kinds of issues with it.
It did. It was and Brian and I shared one of those doctors. We had that in common, and it didn't matter where you were at in the country, and it didn't matter if he had called you in 100 Percocets the day before. You could call him the next night, and I won't mention his name, but a lot of the boys were using this particular doctor, and the next night you could call him, and he'd call you in 100 more, and the next day you could call him, and he'd call you in 100 more. And it wasn't just the pain pills. He was calling in Somas and Xanax and Valium and Halcyon, and it was a very lethal cocktail of drugs.
I remember having a conversation with Tillman a few months before he passed, and he was struggling to kind of get out from under it, and unfortunately never did. But he told me it was almost like kind of a vicious cycle, where you'd take, the downers, the Oxycontin or the Percocets or Percodans, and then he said before your match, a few hours before your match, you'd maybe take some kind of, speed or some kind of amphetamine to kind of get up a bit, and then he said after the match, he said quite often he'd go out partying or go to the bar and he'd maybe indulge in some recreational stuff, and then you'd be taking the painkillers again to get to bed, to get to sleep, and then he said you kept having to up the ante to where you, if originally you're taking one or two, oxycodone, next time you had to take a bit more, and you had to got to the point where you almost were oblivious to how much you were taking and all that kind of thing. I know Brian told me he used to have different guys almost trying to monitor it for him because he was too out of it to do that himself.
You were like a dog chasing your tail every day. And for me, it was almost the opposite of what you expect from the pain medication. For me, it wasn't a downer. It had the exact opposite effect on me. Those pain medications, man, it was like rocket fuel. It was like a turbo booster to me. And, I was wide awake. I was alert. I was full of energy, and I could go out and work and wouldn't even draw a deep breath. So then, for me, I would have to take something at night to go to sleep to bring me down from that Percocet high that I would get from the pain medication. But at my absolute worst, when things were just spinning out of control for me and my life was in turmoil because of these pills, I was taking about 120 Percocet a day. And then if you couple the Somas, the Valiums, the Xanax, all the other things I was taking over 200 pills a day. And I'm fortunate that I'm not one of those guys that passed away.
He probably had a pretty strong constitution. I imagine when you hear about Prince and Michael Jackson and stuff, you probably relate, because from what I hear, that's essentially what happened to them. It's almost like you got to hit bottom or crash before you can kind of start coming back. What was the kind of the darkest hour for you, or what happened? What kind of caused or enabled you to start kind of coming back from all of that?
Well, I kept hitting different bottoms along the way, but what started the process of eventually getting me clean was this doctor that I was telling you about that Brian and I had in common. He got busted and lost his ability to write prescriptions. And so I then started doctor shopping here in my hometown of Columbia. And what I did was I couldn't get enough to feed my habit from just a simple doctor's visit. So I would take the information on a prescription that the doctor had written me, and then I started calling my own prescriptions in. I would use that doctor's information, his name, the address at his practice, the phone number at his practice, and his DEA number. That's a doctor's identification number they give when they call in a prescription to a pharmacy. And I had been around this doctor enough and heard him call prescriptions in for the boys enough that I knew what to say. I knew how to call a prescription in. So I started doing that. And I did it thousands of times, but along the way, I was arrested over 25 times for doing that. And eventually, I had been put on probation. I had been fined. I'd done community service. But eventually, after I think my 28th arrest for prescription forgery, a judge here in South Carolina sentenced me to 18 months in prison. And I did a little less than a year in prison. I went to prison in 2002. Fortunately for me, I knew I had a court date, and it was a couple of months out, and I knew that I was going to do time. Even my own attorney had told me, he said, you've been arrested so many times for this, and you've violated your probation. He said, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. He goes, but you're looking at time, and you're going to do some time, but I'm going to try to minimize it and get you the least amount of time I can. So I had started sort of trying to wean myself off the pain medication, because if you quit cold turkey, that's a horrible dope sickness that nobody wants to experience. So by the time I got to prison, I was pretty much off the pills, but I had substituted those pills with alcohol and cocaine, and so I was still just really out of control, but with a different drug. But I didn't participate in any drug program in prison because they didn't offer one. There wasn't one offered at the prison I was at. But I'll tell you what it did, Bruce. It allowed me an opportunity to get straight as far as getting off drugs, to getting clean, to getting sober. And it allowed me to once again start thinking like a clear-headed, level-headed human being. And it also, too, brought me face-to-face with reality, where I realized what a mess I had made of my life. I mean, I had just ruined everything. I lost my family over it. God, the money I lost over it, and friendships and relationships. And here I am. I mean, I was an All-American at the University of South Carolina. I had a great career as a professional wrestler. Now I'm in shackles and chains in front of a judge, being sentenced to 18 months in prison. And you're like, man, how did I get here? How did this happen? And so it allowed me the time to think and process that and decide that if I did not stop when I got out, if I didn't stop, I'd be back again, or either I'd be dead. So it was an awakening.
Was there any one point where you really hit bottom, Del, or one of those moments that kind of, a turning point or anything? Was just kind of gradual, or was it like any one thing where you just looked in the mirror and were almost kind of breaking down or anything like that?
I think the big moment for me that just reality balled its fist up and it hit me right in the mouth is you couldn't have visitors in prison for the first month. After that, you could have visitors. And Bruce, I'm in a waiting area. My mom's coming to visit me, and I could look out the window of this waiting area into the visitation area. And I saw my mom sitting there waiting on me, and it broke my heart. It crushed me. I thought, this is the lady that gave birth to me. This was the lady that was there the first day I went to school as a kid. She was there when I graduated. She was there when I got married. She was there when my kids were born. She's been there for everything for me. And now she's having to visit me in a prison visitation yard. I was humiliated. I just broke down, and I couldn't believe I had done that to her. And that's when I realized that something had to change with me. It did. It crushed me that my mom had to come to a prison and visit me. And I determined that my life was going to change. And when I got out, I was going to be a different man. And I became a different man while I was there. I relied heavily on my faith and just through prayer and just really trying to become a different man while in prison, walk out a different guy, and never look back. And I've been clean and sober since 2003. I got out Valentine's Day 2003.
That's an incredible story. I think that, I know it certainly moved me just hearing it. I almost coming to tears just listening to it because it's so powerful. But it would seem to me that message would be very impactful and, profound to some of the people out there, in our business that are beset with those demons. And I'm sure there's more than a few of them, I hate to say, I'm told, like, the WWE is endeavoring to do a very pronounced, serious initiative, say no to drugs and all this routine, but it would seem to me that a guy like yourself would be a very valuable, legitimate spokesperson. Has WWE or whatever, they ever made any overtures to you or had any contact relative to that?
They have not. I did a podcast last year with a guy that was connected and had a working, while he wasn't employed with the WWE, he still had a business relationship with them, and he said that he was going to speak to them about that, and I never heard anything back about it, but I would certainly be more than happy if they ever did approach to do something like that, because I feel like I've been truly blessed. While I went through hell to get where I'm at today, I'm alive, and I can talk to you, and I can talk to others. And if there's anything at all that I could ever do to help somebody or maybe prevent somebody from going through what I went through by giving my story and my testimony, I'm more than willing to do that. I'm very transparent. I don't mind sharing what I've been through and what I put myself through with others if it's anything that could possibly help. And I do a lot of speaking at churches and youth groups and business functions and things of that nature, but no, I've never been contacted by anyone.
It would seem to me that a guy like yourself would be an invaluable, asset.
Well, I appreciate that. And you saying that, I feel a lot of times like their attitude, and when I say their attitude, I'm referring to the WWE, is whatever problems those guys had or may have had or these guys have had, that's their problems. That's not our problem. As a matter of fact, I did that show on HBO, Real Sports, with Bryant Gumbel several years back. Piper and I did that show concerning the exact same subject. And when Vince was asked about it, and, his response was, I play no part or responsibility in their untimely death. These are grown men that made decisions to do what they wanted to do. Didn't force that on anyone. And he's right. He didn't force anybody to do anything. But when these guys are working for you and representing your company, you would think that there would be some sort of compassionate side there that would say, hey, man, like you said earlier, these are guys that at one time were clean, pure athletes, and they've got families, and let's reach out here and try to help these guys and do something to maybe prevent it.
I got a caller from area code 347 in New York, and I believe he's going to probably ask Del something about his new DVD. I'll bring Magic Mike Ferreira. He's got the podcast. Welcome from area code 347 from New York. Mike.
Yeah, it wasn't really a question. It was more of a, I just want to let everybody know that I ended up buying his DVD, and I wanted everybody to know that it's so phenomenal. It's just a great 3-disc set. It's unbelievable.
Well, Mike, I appreciate that, man. Thank you.
How would you get that, Del, if you were wanting to order that? Any listeners out there?
You can go to my website, www.Del, and it's D-E-L, DelThePatriotWilkes.com. And you can get the DVD. It's 3-disc. It's over 7 hours. It's my life story. And there are a lot of the guys that I work with in the business that are a part of the DVD, Stan Hansen and Marcus Bagwell and Bill Apter and Bruce Pritchard and many, many more. And there's one of the discs that's really completely solely nothing but matches from All Japan. But it is. Michael Elliott did this documentary for me. He approached me about it, and he did a fantastic job. And but you can go to www.DelThePatriotWilkes.com And we also have our T-shirts, masks, pictures, and the DVD there as well.
Oh, I was going to say, and also, if you go over to ProWrestlingTees.com, you can get the Patriot stuff, because I have his Patriot shirt. I love it. It's my favorite shirt, so I have it.
Well, thanks, Mike, and you're exactly correct. Also, too, you can go to ProWrestlingTees.com. We've got 4 shirts on there, 4 different designs, and we're very proud of them. And we sold quite a few T-shirts there. And but again, the documentary, I talked to several people. We've literally sold those things all over the world. And I wanted to tell the story again for the simple purpose. I didn't, I want people to know that have struggled with what I struggled with, that there is a way out, that there's redemption, that you can regain your life back, you can live a productive life. That was my sole purpose for doing it. I mean, I've been there. I've struggled with it. I've been hopeless. I've stayed up all night crying. I mean, wanting my life back, wanting to just be a normal person again. And so, our hope and prayer and desire is that maybe some way, in some capacity, that it could help someone.